Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Modernize While You Migrate, Unlocking the Long-Term Value in Azure. My name is Sean McManus. I'm our Field CTO for Modern Apps and Data.
And my name is Tom Lilly. I'm our Field CTO for Cloud Solutions.
So today we're going to talk about modernizing while you migrate. We'll talk about the key drivers for modernization, some alternatives to modernization with lift and shift, the essentials of modernization. Then we'll get into some implementation considerations before talking about an execution roadmap. And then following that, no execution, no migration is ever complete until we can measure our success. And then we'll talk about how Netrix can help. So glad you're with us today, and let's get started. First off, across industries, there tends to be common sets of conditions that drive organizations towards modernization. Aging data centers are costly to maintain. They need regular hardware refreshes. They need software patching. And these types of things are non-value add projects that just increase costs. Combine that with consumption-based pricing models of most cloud platforms, and that really has companies these days reevaluating the cost structure of maintaining internal data centers. And security is also a big factor here. Things like cloud native identity, zero trust controls, encryption, and continuous monitoring mean that when properly configured, a cloud platform such as Azure might provide a more resilient and more secure foundation than your typical on-prem data center. Cloud platforms also provide the ability to scale workload dynamically and address shifts in demand. And the global footprint of these services means that you can have reduction in latency and different redundancy models globally that help you mitigate your downtime risk. Additionally, cloud platforms offer comprehensive tooling. We'll talk a lot about that, designed to shrink time to release for new services and features. Think like DevOps and CI/CD or infrastructure as code strategies. And all of these allow for experimentation with new services without having that heavy infrastructure investment. Spin up, experiment, test, and shut down. And now you're paying for that compute, but you're not having to pay for those infrastructure investments long term. And then finally, by reducing technical debt and addressing end-of-life systems, companies can redeploy those expenditures to resources that add value to your company. So a couple of common practices and common approaches to migration and to movement to cloud is, lift and shift versus modernize while you migrate. That lift and shift will get you to the cloud faster and keep the businesses moving. And we'll talk about that in the next few slides, where that approach shines and where it can fall short. And then the contrast to that is the modernize while you migrate approach, which lets you move fast away from on-prem to the cloud and start improving things right away. We'll dig into the details on that approach a little bit later. So Tom's going to talk a little bit more about lift and shift. Take it away, Tom.
Yep. Thanks, Sean. So obviously we want this webinar to be focused a lot on modernizing and why you should modernize, but the main reason that we see that our clients move, or the main mechanism we see our clients move by still, is going to be a lift and shift or a rehost or a forklift migration. The main reason that we see that, we'll get into here in a little bit, but for those of you that haven't seen this before or haven't really undertaken a cloud migration, a rehost or a lift and shift migration is simply, I take a server that lives in my data center, in my co-location facility, in my server closet, somewhere that's not a public cloud, and then it gets brought up into Azure, for example, as a virtual machine. So rather than having the physical server or a virtual infrastructure in my environment that I have to manage, maintain, and monitor, I can move it into the cloud and have somebody else do a lot of that for me. So things like physical security you don't have to worry about, and all the other stuff that kind of gets out of it being in your data center. This is done either with first or third-party tooling. So for Azure, generally we recommend using a tool such as Azure Migrate for a couple different reasons, and we'll get into it later in this presentation when we talk about tooling. But there is also some third-party integration as well. So if you already have Veeam, Zerto, Commvault, any of these other third-party backup or continuous data protection solutions in your environment, then you can actually use that to do this migration, do this failover as well. All of those are options as you start to do this lift and shift migration. So the other benefit and the other thing that you can do is leverage some of your existing tooling and some of your existing licensing and relationships to do this migration under a rehost. The other really good thing from a continuity perspective is as you move your services up, nothing has changed about the virtual machine aside from its IP address, and sometimes not even that. So generally speaking, when you move up into an Azure virtual machine, for example, you essentially shut down the virtual machine on premises. It comes up in the cloud. It's going to be attached to a virtual network, assuming you're using native virtual machines. So this does mean that you have a change in IP address, as your virtual networks do have to have different IPs. Otherwise, routing gets all messed up, as you're probably well aware. But if you do go into a solution like Azure VMware solution, and you're moving from your on-premises environment into AVS, that actually allows you to do layer 2 extension, and you can actually move virtual machines up into Azure VMware without having any IP address change at all. And you're still using VMware, and you're still using a lot of the tooling and the skill set that you have already. So as we can see, that lift and shift migration really becomes that lowest friction and the sort of quickest way to move into the cloud. The biggest downside, though, is that it's not really optimization. It's all about relocation. It's all about, I still need to run these virtual machines. I just don't want to run them in my environment. I don't want to have to worry about maintaining hardware. But you're not really optimizing. You're not taking advantage of cloud native features. You're not, putting elasticity into your applications. It's really just running everything as a status quo. But as I mentioned before, there are a lot of times and a lot of reasons that a lift and shift migration does make sense. So number one, and probably the major thing that we see, is major deadlines. As I've said a couple times, and you'll probably hear me say it a couple more, migrating using a rehost migration is very quick and tends to be relatively easy. So if you have a data center exit coming up, if your hardware is becoming end of life, if you have other hardware that is otherwise not usable anymore, or any impending, or at least a very quickly impending event that needs to get you out of your physical infrastructure, means that a rehost migration probably makes sense for you. If you don't have a lot of time to do some of the things that Sean's going to talk about here in just a little bit, then doing it quick and you're just getting into the cloud, rehost is certainly the way to go. In addition, if you have sort of these workloads that don't have a lot of complexity to them, maybe they're super straightforward, but maybe not a huge value add to the organization. They don't necessitate, or they don't warrant the time, at least at first pass, to do a modernization effort. You can keep those up as virtual machines. Think about like COTS applications, or some of the off-the-shelf applications that you may be using that maybe just do one thing. Ideally, you want to get that stuff modernized eventually, but if it works for you, especially if it's business critical, you may not want to do that from the beginning. So moving that up as part of a virtual machine infrastructure, virtual machine estate, may make a lot of sense. And the same thing is if you have any apps that are going to be retired soon. If the app is only going to be around for another 3, 4, 6 months, whether you move into a SaaS platform or whether you are building your own or whatever that is, it probably doesn't make sense to go undertake a modernization effort for that current application, because it's just not going to be around. At the end of the day, it's going to be a lot easier just to run those virtual machines, patch and maintain them for that 6 months or 8 months, or whatever that cycle is for you, and then just shut them down and get rid of them. Once again, Sean mentioned the elasticity and sort of the pay-as-you-go nature of the cloud. You don't have to worry about paying for that server long term, because you can just shut it down, delete everything, and get rid of it, and not have to think about it ever again. One of the other major things that we see, I sort of alluded to earlier, but that's stabilizing workloads. So a lot of our customers, when they move into the cloud, especially if they have that impending event, as I talked about from the beginning, they still want to modernize later. So that fourth item that we see on the slide here is really about, all right, let's get this database, let's get this front end, let's get this middleware into a good hardware platform, because maybe I'm running on super old CPUs, or I have a memory contention or storage contention, or my storage isn't fast enough, whatever those reasons are. Let's get into a platform that has scaled properly for your application, and let's get it running to have a better user experience, have a better customer experience, have a better even development experience, depending on what that application is. And then we'll modernize it as we go later, whether that's modernizing a component, modernizing the entire thing. So the one big takeaway to keep in mind from where lifts and shift migrations make sense is all about speed and reducing complexity and reducing downtime. That is the main point of all these rehost migrations. Is we need to move fast, we need to move today, and we'll take care of all the fun stuff later. But that being said, it's not the end all be all. There are a lot of situations where rehost migrations don't make sense, where because of complexities, because of issues, because of where you want to go as an organization, that you want to not undertake a lift and shift migration, even if it's the fastest and easiest way to go. And the main thing that we see is when you're going to a lift and shift migration, in the long term, it's going to tend to be a lot more expensive than running on platform services, on running modernized services like Sean's going to talk about here in just a little bit, which may sound counterintuitive. If you do a price to price comparison for a lot of infrastructure platform services can, and in a lot of instances do end up being more expensive on a per gigabyte or a per CPU core basis. But one of the things that you're not taking into account is all the other things that go into managing a VM fleet. So things like people just spinning up a whole bunch of virtual machines and leaving them out there, which means that now you're paying for all the stuff that you don't need anymore. You have all of this technical debt within your environment as well that you're not modernizing, which at the end of the day, not only causes you issues in terms of that sprawl, because now I've got to have this super oversized virtual machine to deal with this very inoptimal code base, or to give my users or my customers that user experience. Whereas a modernized application gives you the opportunity to rewrite and use modern technologies and to use some of the capabilities in cloud native services that can reduce or even eliminate technical debt, at least for the time being. It can also allow you to get into better headspace and better processes around CI/CD, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. People also always forget about the cost of operations. So remember, with virtual machines, you still have to install agents, you still have to patch them, you still have to monitor them all the way down to the operating system. You still have to expand disks as you run out of space. You still have to add additional CPU or add additional RAM, size it up and size it down manually, if there are pressures, or if you have seasonal access to that server or to those servers. There's a large operational burden in running the environment, and that's time that your administrators could be using to be more useful to the organization, whether it is developing or whether it is doing, finding new applications, or whether it is, serving your client base or your customer base or even your internal users. By still managing and maintaining virtual machines, sure, you don't have to do things like worry about disk swaps and warranties and things like that, but everything else from that virtualization layer, from the virtual machine layer, is still going to be up to you and your teams to manage and maintain. In addition, from a security and resilience perspective, the major thing that we see is there's not a lot of benefit there. Sure, you can do some auto scaling, and sure, you can use tools like Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup to make sure you've got additional copies in multiple regions or even multiple zones. But at the end of the day, there's still a major security flaw in that you're running an operating system. The the blast radius in a virtual machine for somebody being able to get in and to persist in that virtual machine from a security perspective is significantly higher than what we see with platform services. The attack surface is significantly higher just because of all the processes that have to run to support the operating system and to support the applications that run in that operating system. So really, even though you're moving into a cloud that may have better edge security, that may have more resilience capabilities than what you have on premises, that doesn't mean that you're minimizing that like you would for a modernization. And really, that's what it comes down to, is by not having that modernization opportunity, it also allows you to kick the can down the road. And I say allows to, even though a lot of people don't want to do that, but for a lot of our customers, one of the things that we always talk about is, great, you've done your rehost migration, you got out of your data center, the contracts have expired, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Don't forget that you need to modernize your workloads. A lot of our customers, if they had their druthers, would just kind of sit back and be like, cool, we're running in the cloud now, we don't have to worry about it, we're not going to modernize, or we'll do that next year. And then next year rolls around, it's like, oh no, we're going to do that next year. And that just keeps happening. They never get that chance to modernize. Whereas sort of forcing your people and forcing your administrators or working with a partner like Netrix to modernize your applications while you migrate forces everybody's hand to do it right now. And it may be a little painful, but it is going to be better in the long run. So, we definitely want to talk about that modernization piece. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sean as our expert on modernization. So Sean, what do you got?
Thanks, Tom. So lift and shift is that great first move for speed, as Tom said, but the next move is often a smarter move. Modernize as you migrate helps you not carry those old costs and complexity forward. I like to think of this as a more thoughtful and measured approach to migration. So start with the right foundation, build landing zones, design your governance, put together your security requirements. And a well-architected landing zone lays that groundwork for all the future cloud development that you do. From there, then you can look to start modernize your high-value workloads. So those could be things like database migrations, could be application replatforming, could be other items that include a large on-prem cost or items in your internal data center that have accumulated significant technical debt. A big part of this is being able to leverage modern tools to improve automation and repeatability. So think about things like infrastructure as code that will allow you to remove that one-off manual environment build. You can script that and automate that. CI/CD pipelines, on the other hand, will also handle like the provisioning and deployment, testing and validation. They'll do all that automatically. So this allows you to build out these patterns that can be repeated for subsequent workloads. So therefore, your first wave may have a certain amount of implementation time, but subsequent waves can have that implementation time reduced because you're learning as you go. You're setting up these pipelines, you're setting up these IAC builds, and you're able to migrate faster as you get forward. And then finally, those cloud platforms allow you to leverage all kinds of tools to do cost optimization and performance tuning, which that helps you improve and accelerate the ROI on that migration there. So we've talked about some of those core components, successful modernizing while you migrate approach. Let's take a look next at which of those modernization moves delivers the results the fastest. So a fast ROI really equates to changes that you make that can reduce your run costs. So licensing, operational effort, incident resolution, and do that within the first 1 to 2 migration waves. So by focusing on these areas, you can move that needle more quickly during your own migration efforts. And database modernization is one of the fastest payback moves we see in cloud migration. Databases tend to carry the highest licensing cost. They incur the most manual maintenance effort and carry the greatest outage risks. So by leveraging things like Azure SQL Server, Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can offload all of those patching and backup and failover and maintenance tasks that you're currently doing internally and let those teams get time back. Your incidents drop and you avoid carrying some of those expensive legacy configurations into Azure. So throw all that together and you're going to alone just meaningfully reduce that 1 year run cost. Secondly, replatforming apps is another place where we see rapid operational improvements. So moving a web app to or an API to an app service, or even containerizing it, that removes that need to maintain custom VM images or patch runtimes or fight that configuration drift that can be a burden. That allows your release cycles to become more predictable, reducing failures. And then again, your teams spend fewer hours babysitting environments. And that's kind of a key thing that we're seeing with that movement of the cloud is the more that you're offloading some of those mundane, repetitive maintenance tasks from your teams, you're giving time back to those individuals to be doing more value add projects. And then finally here on moving the needle, identity and security uplift are also projects here that'll give you a fast ROI because it reduces that reoccurring operational friction. So things like moving to Entra-based identity, adding conditional access, adding RBAC and PIM, those things mean fewer access tickets, fewer privilege exceptions, fewer audit findings. And it lowers that probability and the impact of any security instances that you might have during and after migration. And the key thing about this is that these improvements are foundational. So you apply them once, and then every workload that you migrate afterwards gets to see that same benefit. So next, we're going to go look into grouping some of these modernization workloads into a couple different silos. First, infrastructure, and then we'll start talk a little bit more about databases. So as you move those workloads into Azure, one of the biggest early wins is simply getting rid of all of the over-provisioning that naturally happens with an on-prem data center. Most environments tend to grow unevenly over years. Servers get sized for your peak usage, and those old assumptions on that usage stick around. And before you know it, you're running far more infrastructure on-prem than you actually need. Azure cloud computing allows you to right size your infrastructure based on actually real consumption numbers, and you are able to standardize on consistent VM families and images. That alone can cut costs and reduce complexity almost immediately. Another big area is patching and configuration drift. So on-prem teams spend a huge amount of time chasing patches, they're fixing inconsistencies, trying to keep environments aligned. With things like Azure Automation, Azure Update Manager, and policy work, you can get rid of most of that manual effort. And that makes your environment both consistent and it reduces the risk of outages, and while giving your team free time back to focus on more meaningful work. Then there's also resiliency. Azure gives those native capabilities like availability zones, auto scaling, and built-in load balancing that would be extremely hard, expensive, or even impossible to reproduce in a data center. So think about a global company that has offices all over the world, or people that travel that are always moving around, and you can have those availability zones and those redundancies set up so that they're always connecting to data centers that are closest to their geographical region, improving their performance. And you don't have to redesign applications from scratch to take advantage of all those features either. That's kind of the key here. You can simply just land them in a platform that makes that resilience easier. Also, a lot of organizations bring with them custom-built tools, so things like homegrown logging, monitoring, backup scripts, job schedulers, that can be replaced by the managed services that are available inside cloud platforms like Azure. And those solutions make things easier to run, more reliable, far less fragile. So essentially think of replacing all of these DIY components and then being able to reduce that operational burden along with it. And then finally, repeatability is what ties all this together. So, like, again, we talked about using infrastructure as code, landing zone patterns. That means that every environment that you deploy can be deployed securely and consistently. And that consistency accelerates with each migration wave and makes that entire cloud environment easier to operate and to scale. So, as we mentioned earlier, database modernization is one of the quickest ways to make a meaningful impact during a migration. DBs usually carry that highest licensing cost, operational overhead, and as we said before, like the biggest risk if something goes wrong. So by improving them early, you get that quick payoff. The shift to Azure SQL database or Azure SQL managed instance alone takes a huge amount of that day-to-day work off your team's plate. So using things like built-in high availability, automated backups to help make your environment more predictable. And then reducing complexity with things like managed services. You're not paying for those idle VM cores or having to deal with legacy configurations that slow things down. You can like right size that footprint and get that platform where you need it, reducing costs, but then still being able to scale as you need going forward. And then getting your data there safely is also critical. So there's proven cutover patterns, things like continuous replication, things like blue-green deployments, and near zero downtime syncs that help you rehearse that migration and minimize risk to ensure that your applications keep running smoothly even during the transition. And then once those databases are in Azure, that's where you can really start seeing benefits by optimizing. You can validate performance, tune queries, and take advantage of some of those built-in resiliency features. See, the key here is not just to move everything into Azure, it's to move it into Azure, modernize it, and make it run better, be more stable, and then cost less over time. So database modernization tends to deliver such a strong ROI because it can reduce all of those incidents, simplify operations, lower all those licensing costs, and then again, give time back to your team to focus on more strategic work. So like moving forward, we've covered the what and the why. Now let's start talking about some of the how, the practical implementation details and Azure platform choices that help you make these strategies come to life.
Yeah, and really where we want to start is actually another why, and why we're doing this webinar, and that is why Azure for modernization. Obviously, those of you who have worked with Netrix know that we are a solution partner. We've been a big Microsoft partner for many, many years, and Azure for the longest time has been our recommended cloud for migration, even though we have expertise in other clouds as well. And one of the main things that I see when I'm talking to my clients about why Azure is really that first item that's all along the top is Azure Arc. So for a lot of the organizations that I'm working with, and hopefully for a lot of you who are watching this webinar, you're not going to move out of your data center tomorrow. Maybe you do have that lift and shift that has to happen, and maybe you do, have that impending event. But for the overwhelming majority of my customers, what I'm seeing is hybrid cloud, or what Microsoft is now referring to as the adaptive cloud, is here to stay for at least a little while longer. And the big thing that we see from an Azure perspective is Azure Arc. So for those of you who haven't worked with Azure Arc essentially allows you to install either a resource bridge or a direct agent into machines on premises and run those machines almost like they are Azure virtual machines, even though they're in your data center. That includes things like security and posture management, as well as monitoring. It can enable solutions like Sentinel, but that essentially allows you to cloudify your on-premises data center. It also allows you to deploy some cloud services into that data center as well. So data services, Kubernetes, et cetera. So really the reason we see why to move to Azure is actually why people don't move to Azure. It's having that modernization capability. It's having that on-premises sort of extension of Azure into your data center. Now, you still have some of the hardware constraints, obviously the physical patching. So, migrating and modernizing and getting into a hyperscaler does make sense longer term, but Arc is great for that sort of middle ground adaptive cloud that a lot of our customers are currently adopting. But as you move into the cloud, one of the major things that we are seeing from an Azure perspective is got to be compliance and security. We are a managed security service provider, an MSSP, and one of the major platforms that we use for our MSSP services is Sentinel. So Microsoft is taking in these trillions and trillions of signals every single day across every single one of their platforms. Both enterprise, prosumer, and consumer. So you have M365 access logs, and then you've got Xbox Live logs, right? That are all sort of going into this major data lake and threat intelligence feed that Microsoft is curating. So all of that stuff is automatically applied in a lot of instances to your environment when you are in Azure. So having those trillions and trillions of signals used to monitor and to secure your environment, as well as some of the built-in compliance. Once again, the cloud is a shared responsibility model, so Microsoft doesn't take care of everything for you. But if you need GDPR or CCPA or ISO 27001 or NIST 853, any of those compliances, Microsoft has an overwhelming majority of them built into their physical infrastructure and built into their platform. So you don't have to worry about, securing your infrastructure and having, a secure data center or things like that. That's being taken care of for you because of that shared responsibility model and that underlying infrastructure. The other major benefit that we see from our customers is what's called Azure Hybrid Benefit. This is essentially bringing your own licensing as you move into the cloud. So if you are running Windows Server Data Center with software assurance, Windows Server Standard with software assurance, or SQL Enterprise with software assurance, you have some of these capabilities to bring these licenses with you rather than paying for them as you're running the service. So now, rather than paying for the Windows licensing on top of my virtual machine, or paying for my vCores for my SQL managed instance, I can bring that licensing I've already made that investment in to Azure with me and not have to pay that additional fee. That can sometimes drop the cost for these services by up to 40% on that running cost. And once again, your organization has already paid for the licenses, they already own them. That way you're not essentially making or having them go to waste. So by being able to bring your own licensing, by being able to leverage that Azure Hybrid Benefit, you can reduce the overall running cost and maintain some of those contracts and maintain some of the costing that you've already put together toward that licensing for your organization. The other big thing that we see is the multitude of platform and overall data services in Azure. This could be something that's more unified like a Microsoft Fabric. It could be something where you're building your own like storage accounts and analysis services and Synapse and Databricks and all these kind of things that are also built on top of Azure. It's really up to you and how you choose to architect your environment. But the thing to keep in mind is that Azure's got hundreds and hundreds of services across thousands and thousands of different SKUs to give you the right service, the right experience, and the right size for your applications as you modernize them. So now you don't have to worry about having one giant web application or one giant web server because you have to account for spikes in traffic and things like that. Sean mentioned modernizing earlier and breaking out those services into smaller web apps, or maybe you go into a microservices architecture. So now I can have a lot of different little services that all scale based on need, and once again can reduce costs where I don't need to spend them, rather than having one giant monolithic application, one giant monolithic server to run that app. And then also, as Sean mentioned before, Azure has a worldwide scale. At the time of this webinar, I think there's over 60 to 70 regions, both deployed and announced. So if you need to scale something up worldwide, you can. If you need to scale something up in the same geo, for example, on both the east and west coasts of the United States, maybe you're doing an expansion into Mexico. Maybe you're opening an office in EMEA or in the UK, and you need to have a presence out there, in relatively short order. You don't have to worry about signing data center or co-location facility contracts. You don't have to worry about, import tariffs. You don't have to worry about getting hardware into those locations. It's all done for you because of the scale of the public cloud. So that's really why we're seeing a lot of our customers move toward Azure as that modernization target, and really some of the benefits that we are seeing. That being said, when you move, there is one thing that you should always do first, And anybody who I've talked to knows about this. Sean's heard me talk about this many times, and that is you need to deploy an Azure landing zone. If you're unfamiliar with an Azure landing zone, it encompasses a lot of different things, but we sort of distilled it into 6 major areas here. Number 1 is subscription and management group hierarchy. I can't tell you how many times I go into a customer and they've got dozens or hundreds of subscriptions, and they're called Azure Subscription 1 or Azure Enterprise, or something along those lines, with no overarching hierarchy. They've got no sort of information about what those subs are being used for, and they're just sprawling all over the place, and that obviously increased cost, increased management overhead, etc. So number 1 is build out that management group hierarchy, get your parent-child relationships down, and then file your subscriptions away into those management groups. And it doesn't have to be complex. Do 3 of them, or do 2 of them, whatever suits you as an organization. Hey, I've got one management group for prod, I've got one management group for non-prod, and I've got several subscriptions underneath each one. Because you can apply things like Azure Role-Based Access Control, which we'll get into here in just a second, at the resource group level, or at the subscription, or at that management group level, that inheritance is done for you automatically. So it means you can better secure and better apply permissions where you need to. Number 2 has got to be networking. So a lot of my customers just go in and they deploy virtual networks, and they just keep the defaults. And a lot of times the defaults from a VNet perspective are /16s, which anybody who knows networking knows that's a pretty big slice to take out of any sort of private IP space. So standardize your networking, create an overall IP scheme, implement an IPAM solution, deploy hub and spoke topology, deploy centralized firewalls for ingress and egress, deploy, centralized API management, things like that. Make sure that you have that networking squared away, because especially for those of you that are going to be having a hybrid or adaptive cloud, having that cross-premises connectivity is exceedingly important. And having that sort of centralized firewall for ingress and egress is also important. Microsoft does also have built-in firewalling services through Azure Firewall. A lot of times we recommend our customers at least evaluate that, because it does do things like auto scale with traffic. Otherwise, you can bring your own favorite firewall solution like Palo Alto into the cloud as well if you need to. Talked a little bit about RBAC and role-based access control, but define your roles, define your scopes, define custom roles, determine what teams need to do what. Make sure you have all that squared away. Make sure that you know who's got access to what. Sean mentioned PIM earlier. Implement just-in-time access, implement just enough administration. Make sure you've got all of your sort of capabilities squared away with RBAC. You don't want to have a large blast radius for your administrator accounts at the management plane if something were to happen and an account were to be compromised. So make sure you know the roles and the scopes in which you're applying things. Don't give your developers owner over production. They'll just go in and start shutting stuff down or scaling stuff up. Nobody wants that to happen. So make sure you've got that kind of squared away. We talked a little bit about centralized logging and monitoring. This does include Sentinel if you need a SIM SOAR platform. Obviously, you can do third-party integration there as well, but deploy log analytics, deploy Sentinel. In your operations, start looking at Azure Monitor. All of these things go into maintaining and managing that landing zone going forward. And a lot of that, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this. Once again, anybody who's ever been in a meeting with me about landing zones has probably heard me talk about naming conventions. Naming conventions are one of the most important and most overlooked items that we see in our landing zones. Everything in Azure gets a name, whether it's a virtual machine or a SQL PaaS instance or a web application or a virtual machine IP configuration on a network interface, which also has its own name, and also the OS disk and all the data disks and your storage accounts and your containers. Everything gets a name in Azure, and those names can't be changed later. So please, please, please establish naming conventions. Try to automate where possible if you can, but please think about what you're naming your resources. It always is funny to go into environments and see like my VM 01 or server or 02 or my storage account or whatever it is. That doesn't do anybody any good. Leverage naming conventions. If you can't leverage naming conventions, then enforce Azure policy to leverage tags. Make people tag their resources with an application name or a cost center or a department or an owner. Use Azure policy to enforce things like that and to enforce everything we're talking about here on this slide. Use it to enforce that people need to have diagnostic settings turned on. Use it to enforce your naming conventions. Use it to enforce that people are deploying the right services in conjunction with role-based access control. Azure policy is that service that, once again, is severely overlooked because people see it as a complex solution, but it is the easiest way to ensure that your services are being deployed within your specification as an organization. But in addition to Azure policy, we also see other tooling that we want to talk about here as we get into the migration, both pre and post migration. Pre-migration and even during the migration, the main tool that we see is Azure Migrate, at least if you're going into a rehost migration or you're doing an assessment. Because Azure Migrate has two major capabilities. Number one is assess. So Azure Migrate can tie right into your environment. It can talk directly to vCenter, it can talk directly to Hyper-V, talk directly to physical machines. And what it can do is it can do that right sizing that Sean was talking about earlier. And that's kind of table stakes, right? We can do that with a lot of different assessment tools. But where Azure Migrate also really shines from an assessment perspective is it can also take a look at your SQL servers. You can take a look at your web applications. You can actually take a look at your code base and see if they are candidates for modernization. So now you can have a reasonable degree of certainty that as you move and as you migrate your services into the cloud, that yes, this can migrate, or these are the pitfalls that we need to account for as we get into this migration. People overlook that in Azure Migrate, is that they think it's really just for moving virtual machines. It's not. Microsoft has made some significant investments in it over the years where it can do some of this modernization effort for you. The other major thing that Azure Migrate can do during assessment is dependency mapping. If you're wondering how all of your services talk to each other, on what ports and protocols and things like that, Azure Migrate can do that discovery for you automatically. This can help with migration batching. It can help with modernization, because now you can see how all of your services, even within the same machine, interact with each other. And it allows you to, once again, create that migration roadmap over whatever term you need to get into the cloud. Azure Migrate, in addition, also allows you to migrate into virtual machines pretty easily. So now, if I need to replicate that VM up, if I need to have that continuous data protection, if I need to move as that rehost, as that lift and shift, Azure Migrate becomes that mechanism by which I can do so. It's natively integrated with Azure. It can once again natively integrate with your hypervisor of choice or physical machines to do that bit for bit replication and do that automated failover of re-IPing and renaming resources and things like that as they do failover. So Azure Migrate still maintains is still maintained as our number one recommendation for migration, for assessment, most definitely, and then migration if you are moving for virtual machines. Once again, not to say you can't use third-party solutions. Long-term management and maintenance, we also highly recommend implementing an infrastructure as code solution or an IAC solution. So this is something like Bicep if you want to go native to Azure, or if you're looking at something third-party, the one that we tend to recommend is Terraform. Sean mentioned CI/CD, or continuous integration, continuous deployment earlier, where now we can actually couple the infrastructure and the underlying resources with the same software-defined lifecycle as my code. So now, if I'm deploying a new API, or I am deploying a new version of the web app that maybe is switching to a different middle tier or middleware, I can incorporate that into my infrastructure as code and have everything sort of share the same. So now, hey, I've got a new version of this. I'm going to go ahead and deploy it at the same time as my new version of this web app, or as the new database, or whatever that ends up being. And that's all defined within my source control, which is great because it can go through the same approval gates. It can go through the same deployment mechanisms. We were talking about role-based access control and not over-permissioning people. Well, now, if I need to deploy a server, I don't need somebody to be a VM contributor or an overall contributor, heaven forbid, an owner over the environment or the resource group. I can give that to my CI/CD pipeline, to my runner, and then that is the only service that has the permissions to do these deployments. So by adopting an infrastructure as code solution, and especially leveraging something like modules where you can standardize those deployments very easily, it allows you to better run and operate and do standardized deployments in the long term against that landing zone, and to make sure the environment is properly maintained long term. In addition to that, though, there are some other things that we highly recommend for database and other service migration and long-term maintenance, which I'm going to turn it over to Sean to talk about. So, Sean, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So that the database migration service, or DMS, that's built into Azure is really a fully managed service that's designed to move on-prem or cloud databases to Azure and minimize downtime. So it gives you that control and predictability by using some proven cutover techniques, continuous replication, blue green migrations, rehearsal cycles, and it has comprehensive support for all kinds of different data and objects in the database world here. So that's a huge benefit if you're trying to do that database migration piece. The other one we want to highlight here are what we call migration patterns, which are really just our playbooks, the proven approaches that we use to modernize workloads during migration. So it's essentially, instead of trying to figure out things from scratch every time, you can apply repeatable patterns for things like moving apps to app services, or introducing containers, or uplifting identity and security. And you validate those patterns so that they help you move faster each time in each migration wave, avoiding rework and modernizing as safely as you can. So let's take everything we've talked about and put it into a practical roadmap. Think of the steps here that we would follow to move workloads to Azure safely and predictably. Step one, discover and assess. Every migration starts with the understanding of your current state. So this is where you take that inventory, map your dependencies, look at performance baselines, and then figure out how everything fits together. The goal here is simple. It's like, get rid of those surprises later by getting a clear picture of your current environment up front. Step two would be segment your workloads. So once you know what's in the environment, you can start grouping those workloads into logical waves based on the criteria and strategies we discussed earlier. By segmenting workloads this way, you can also quickly move without biting off too much at once. Step three, building foundations. Before everything moves, you're going to build the landing zone. So Tom talked at detail about landing zones and why that's important. All those core pieces that make Azure stable, safe, and predictable. This is a key piece of the puzzle here, and ensures that when those workloads do arrive, they land in something that's well designed and not just an empty subscription. From there, step four, modernize and in waves. So from there, you start moving your workloads into structured waves. Some apps, as we talked about, will get lifted and shifted as it makes some sense, while others will get that targeted modernization along the way. So here we talked about upgrading databases. We talked about replatforming apps, security. It's really that steady, repeatable process that builds momentum instead of trying to transform everything at once. And then finally, you're going to optimize and operationalize. So once those workloads are running in Azure, you can fine tune. That's where you right size things, look at cost, look at performance, and make sure all of your operations are aligned with the cloud native tools and processes. Again, the goal here isn't just to get your workloads into Azure, it's to make them run better than they ever did on-prem. At the end of the day, this roadmap is what keeps your whole journey predictable, repeatable, and focused on delivering real value at each step. Tom?
And obviously the goal at the end is to have a successful migration or modernization campaign. But one of the things that we hear from our customers a lot is, well, what does that mean? So Sean mentioned the 5 different steps, and the first one there is really discover and assess. The other part of discovery and assessment that really becomes important is defining your success criteria. What makes a migration successful? Is it we just need to get out of our data center? Is it we want to take advantage of cloud native services? A lot of that has to be defined up front. And some of the measures that we see from our migrations really, they align very closely to the pillars of the well architected framework, at least for the most part. And these are some of the things that you can use to justify the migration, or that you want to take a look at as you're doing that migration. So for example, from a costing perspective, is my cost per CPU going down? Are my workloads right sized? Do I have the right budgets and the right alerts built into it? Are my monthly costs in line with what Azure Migrate was projecting, or what my architects were projecting? From my operations team, what is my mean time to resolution? Now that I don't have virtual machines, or now that I have some of these cloud native capabilities, has my MTTR gone down? Do I have a more concise incident response plan? If something were to happen, or the environment were to get attacked, am I seeing fewer incidents happen? Am I seeing fewer things sort of go wrong, et cetera? The other piece to security is governance, risk, and compliance, right? Is GRC. Do I have all that logging turned on? Do I have dashboards that I can now leverage a lot easier than I could if I was on premises? Am I taking advantage of Microsoft Defender for Cloud and some of their compliance, outputs and AOCs and things like that for my GRC team to see, how my environment is actually operating? There are a lot of those things that we can really take advantage of, and you have that better visibility into from a just security and observability perspective. Obviously, you hate to see any sort of event, but am I seeing a decrease in RTOs? Am I seeing a decrease in RPOs? Can I do regular DR testing using Azure Site Recovery, or using read-only replicas built into Azure SQL Database, for example? Do I have these capabilities to be able to do this regular testing, to be in compliance, or to make my users more confident that things will be okay if there was an incident in my primary region? And then long term, from an operations perspective, can I deploy more quickly? Can I be more agile? Am I really taking advantage of CI/CD and infrastructure as code, and a bunch of the things that we really talked about? A lot of these things are really important as you go long term into your Azure environment, to see that it is successful for you and that you are leveraging the cloud as you should. And these aren't obviously an exhaustive list of success measures. Success for every organization looks different as you move into the cloud. So please make sure you're talking to your key stakeholders from across the organization to determine what success looks for everybody. Because we want to make sure that everybody's pulling in the same direction. You don't have dissenters. You don't have people that want to stay on premises or are going to get in the way. Because that's the easiest way to have a failed migration, if you don't have this stuff defined, if you don't have the right people on board. So with that, Sean, I'm going to turn it back over to you to kind of wrap it up, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to help.
Yeah, and in summary, migration alone isn't enough. Modernizing as you migrate is going to help you see faster results, lower costs, and have fewer issues, stronger security, and a more stable cloud foundation that will actually scale. Migration will get you to the cloud, but modernization is really what makes Azure truly pay off. And as you start thinking about that, your own journey, you don't have to navigate it alone. Netrix has a number of offerings here. We can help you get started. I'll talk about a couple of those. Our application modernization springboards, our sessions where we get together with your team and we start outlining requirements and putting together a plan for moving your applications to the cloud. And that can be as detailed as we need it to be to come up with that roadmap. And then we also do a data platform modernization jumpstart, which is essentially getting you started with a cloud data platform. So that could include those database modernization migration efforts. It could include just starting up an instance of Microsoft Fabric and looking through the various requirements and proof of concepts that you would need to aggregate data from different data sources and bring that into the cloud platform for the goal of future business analytics and reporting. So those are two key offerings that we have in that space. I think Tom's got a few that he's going to talk about on the cloud and security space as well.
Absolutely. So number one is our cloud decision workshop. So if you're unsure if you want to move to the cloud, or if you're unsure if Azure is the right cloud for you, we can help you determine if that is going to be the case. So we can actually come in, take a high level look at your environment, have some discussions with your stakeholders, and help you make a decision about whether moving to the cloud is the right decision or whether Azure is the right decision for you to migrate into. In addition to that, if you want to move, we can also do what are called cloud migration assessments. So this is once again based very heavily off of Azure Migrate. The goal would be to get an Azure Migrate appliance deployed, and we can do a scan of your environment, start to get you some of your projected costs, some of your modernization targets, and help with some high-level sort of first mover migrations as well, or migration assessments, and identify what those first movers are. So that's sort of that first step into getting you into the cloud. For those of you that have a cloud presence already, and you're concerned about things like security or even cost optimization or the reliability of your environment, we can also perform an assessment of your existing Azure environment to essentially see if your landing zone, your existing foundation, is sufficient for migrating workloads into it, or whether there are some gaps that you need to shore up before you start your first migration. Because the last thing you want to do is migrate your resources into an environment that's not ready for it, and then you're just exacerbating issues, which can be very problematic. So if any of those are of interest to you, I highly recommend that you reach out to us. If you're a current Netrix client, please feel free to reach out to your account executive, or you can reach out to Sean or myself. If you haven't had the privilege to work with us yet, you can always reach out to us at info@netrixglobal.com, and we will gladly find somebody to have these conversations with you. With that, I've been Tom Lilly with Sean McManus. Thank you, everybody, for watching this webinar, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thanks everyone.